Hey everyone, welcome to the final session of this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. My name is Aaron Wendland. I'm Vision Fellow in Public Philosophy at King's College London and a Senior Research Fellow at Massey College, Toronto, and it's an honor to be hosting this benefit event. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis, and is meant to generate support for establishing a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. This center will provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who are doing excellent work in very difficult circumstances. We'll put some information up on the screen after the talk that will enable you to contribute to this cause, and we encourage you to give generously. That said, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome our next speaker, Simon Critchley. Simon is Hans Jonas Professor at the New School for Social Research. His books include Very Little, Almost Nothing, Infinitely Demanding, The Book of Dead Philosophers, and The Faith of the Faithless. He has also written a novella, Memory Theater, and a book-length essay, Notes on Suicide. He was the series moderator of The Stone, a philosophy column in the New York Times, and co-editor of 3 volumes connected to that series, most recently, Question Everything. The title of Simon's talk, fittingly enough, is Question Everything, the story of the stone and philosophy in the New York Times. Simon, it's great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Aaron. And thank you for taking this initiative. It's very, very important. And I'd just like to begin by expressing my solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And like many others, I've been profoundly impressed by the courage and the strength of the Ukrainian people in the face of this hostile, bloody, and criminal invasion by Russia. And what has happened in Ukraine is an outrage. I can't really imagine the horrors that many Ukrainians have experienced in the last year. I followed the news obsessively, but I'm not there. I have obviously empathy for what's happening, and I wish you all the strength that I can profess in your struggle for sovereignty, and I wish you victory in that struggle. And philosophy and it's to put this very simply, philosophy matters. Philosophy has always mattered, and it is for everyone. The idea that philosophy is some otherworldly activity conducted by a handful of remote individuals tucked away in institutions of higher learning is, I think, deeply misguided. Philosophy is an activity that assesses and presses public opinion, what the Greeks called doxa. It's the assessing, pressing, questioning of doxa, public opinion, by raising questions. And the questions that it raises have a particular form. They're universal questions, questions of the greatest generality. The questions like, what is knowledge? What is justice? What is love? So the form of the philosophical question is, what is X? And that's different from how questions have been asked previously in history. What is justice for the Spartans or the Athenians or the barbarians or whatever? No, what is justice in general, universally? And the hope that drives this activity of questioning is that these universal questions combine with the activity of argument, inquiry through argument, what the Greeks called dialectic, that this activity of questioning pursued through argument can have an educative effect, and it can have an emancipatory effect. It's the way in which human beings can free themselves. And philosophy, you could say, I would say, and this is with the great American philosopher Stanley Cavell, what is philosophy? Philosophy is the education of grown-ups. That's really it. Philosophy is the education of grown-ups, and we need that education continually. And for me, philosophy, I've always thought this, philosophy must form part of the life of a culture. Philosophy isn't an academic pursuit and a pursuit that's remote from wider cultural social life. It must engage the public and influence how a culture converses with itself, how a culture thinks about itself, and how a culture thinks about its relationship to other cultures. And so for me, a full understanding of what it means to live in a culture, in a place, has to be informed by philosophy as a public activity. And that's what we tried to do in this adventure called The Stone. And Aaron asked me to say a few words about this, and I'll say a few words about it. The Stone, like most good things, began over a drink in a bar on Smith Street in Brooklyn between myself and an editor at the New York Times called Peter Catapano. And we've become friends. We've begun to work with each other. And then we formed this idea over a drink of having a philosophy column in the New York Times. And for those of you outside the United States, I think it's hard to get a sense of the importance of the New York Times as an organ for cultural, political discussion. It really is, for many Americans, kind of the cigarette paper that separates civilization from barbarism. And so we had this chance of doing a philosophy column on what was called in the old days the website. There was the newspaper, the print newspaper, which was the real thing, and then there was a website. And on this website, they weren't really paying that much attention, and we were allowed to do things really incredibly freely, which is what we did. And we discovered, this began in 2010, and we began to publish pieces on philosophy. I wrote a number, but a lot of other people wrote a lot more. And we found the following, remarkable result, which is that there's an interest in philosophy. There's a genuine public interest in philosophy. If the writing is good, it's clear, it makes a point, it's compelling, and it's free of academic jargon. And we discovered very quickly that it didn't really matter to our readers who the writers were. So it wasn't a question of having, say, famous people writing pieces. It was a question of whether the topic was good, whether it was interesting, whether it was something people wanted to think about. And so we began to do that, and we developed a really quite large online community, as I guess you'd call it now. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. And it kind of, so what I said at the beginning about philosophy forming part of the life of a culture, well, one way of doing that is by participating in the fourth estate of a republic, of a democracy, the press, the journalism, and trying to show that philosophy has a place there. But the activity of the Stone was based in a friendship. It's very important to remember that philosophy is often rooted in friendship, and a friendship between myself and my editor, Peter Catapano. And we worked intensely for years, and we read a lot of things, published a lot of things, and it was a great ride. And we published these books, and the last one that just came out last November. Is called Question Everything, and that's kind of the, if you like, the motto of the stone: question everything. And it covers the years really from 2015 to 2021, if you like, the Trump years. And it's organized in terms of a series of themes and interesting stuff. So there you are. Now, let's turn more closely back to philosophy and think about the nature of this activity, and then, and then implicitly what it's good for. The philosophy is a notoriously self-reflexive discipline. There's no agreement on what counts as philosophy. And in many ways, philosophy begins and ends with the question, what is philosophy? And this leads to the accusation that philosophy is a kind of navel gazing or armchair pondering, or it's something worse than that. But these accusations are short-sighted. Philosophy you can say philosophy has always been everywhere in culture, but philosophy in its recognizable form, where that term philosophy is first used, begins in ancient Greece with the person of Socrates. And Socrates was someone who questioned everything. He was subsequently tried and executed by the city of Athens on two charges: the charge of impiety towards the gods and corruption of the young, the corruption of youth. And keep those things in mind, that philosophy questions everything, and philosophy has a complex relationship to the city, to politics. And the accusation that's often been leveled against philosophy is impiety to whichever gods happen to be the gods of the time, and corruption of the youth. The way Socrates corrupted the youth and led an impious life was by talking to people. He talked to people, he engaged them in dialogue. And these dialogues would often be with people that were called sophists. And they were called sophists because what their activity was linked to another Greek term, sophia, wisdom. Sophists were people who thought they knew something, and if you paid them money, then they could sell you some of that wisdom. Socrates simply asked them questions and revealed that they didn't really know what they were talking about. The wisdom that they sought to sell was bogus in its claims. That's all he did. He went around asking questions of people who claimed to know, showing that actually they didn't know if they were asked a series of simple, direct questions. Their positions fell apart. So philosophy begins by asking, and really ends, but begins by asking difficult questions of this universal form. What is X? What is knowledge? What is truth? And it uses techniques of argumentation to show that those who claim to know something are advancing questionable claims. So the main task of philosophy on this view, if you like, the good of philosophy, is deflationary. It's you're sticking a pin in a balloon of knowledge. Someone who claims to know, whether they're an opinion leader or a political leader or an autocrat or a guru, right? Philosophy is anti-guru, basically, in its essence, anti-guru. And but that doesn't mean, so Socrates goes around asking these questions and debunking the claims that the sophists advance, but that doesn't mean that the philosopher herself or himself possesses knowledge or wisdom. Right? It's a very important point. It deflates, it debunks, but it doesn't mean that the philosopher has knowledge or wisdom. philosophy is the love of wisdom, not the possession of wisdom. And Socrates was pronounced, and this is the key thing to remember, Socrates was pronounced the wisest man in Greece, right? A, and then B, he constantly professed to know nothing. Right? So the wisest man in Greece who professes to know nothing. What does that tell us? It means that whatever wisdom means, it does not consist in purported claims to knowledge. And someone that claims to know nothing can actually be the wisest person. So philosophy begins, I would say, and what it's good for is a movement into perplexity, about the most general and fundamental issues that concern human affairs. And that movement into perplexity is what the Greeks called aporia, right? Aporia, this idea that there is, we deflate and then we move into perplexity by raising questions. Now, that sense of the activity of philosophy being essentially an activity of questioning, you can find that revived in 20th century philosophers that I'm very attached to, someone like Martin Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger's whole philosophical enterprise is organized around the question of being, what he called the Seinsfrage, the question of being. He doesn't know what being is. He doesn't have a claim about being. He doesn't have some secret wisdom about being. His claim is that we have lost sight of the question of being, the questionability of human existence. And if we can reclaim that, and we can reclaim that by a movement into perplexity, then we'll be in a better position. Last thing I'll say, and I'll wrap up. I guess we're doing okay for time, but tiny bit more. The question of what is philosophy and what it's good for, and this is the way the Stone began back in the day in 2010, was by asking a related question, which is what is a philosopher? What is a philosopher? And at this point, I and people like me, you tend to reach for a text. Again, this is often misunderstood. We don't have an antiquarian interest in texts as such. Texts are tools. They are ways of opening questions. They're ways of thinking actively about a topic. There's a text by Plato, a dialogue called Theaetetus. It's a difficult dialogue, and in this dialogue there is something that scholars call a digression. It's not a digression; it's actually something really essential about the activity of philosophy, but it's called a digression. And in this digression, Socrates tells us something about the nature of philosophy and the philosopher. And he tells the story of Thales. Thales was the first philosopher on this view. He was looking, Thales, so intently at the stars. He was looking at the heavens so intently, a bit like us now with those surveillance balloons and all that stuff in the atmosphere, looking up so hard that he fell into a well, or some reports fell into a ditch. And then there was this Thracian servant girl who laughed at him, found this ridiculous, laughed at him. So what is a philosopher? A philosopher is someone who is looking at the sky, looking at the stars, falls into a ditch and promotes laughter. So in this view, what is a philosopher? A philosopher is a kind of laughingstock and absent-minded buffoon. I think this is really important to the understanding of, if you like, what philosophy is good for. Philosophy is a comic activity. This activity of questioning is also a comic activity. It's why a lot of what we do in philosophy is similar to a lot of what the best stand-up comedians do. And it's an activity. The philosopher engages in activity which is clumsy in relationship to worldly affairs. Clumsy in relationship to worldly affairs. It gives the impression of someone who is a bit silly, and that's important to remember. The philosopher is an absent-minded buffoon. Now, going back to this text, this so-called digression, and this is the point I want to make. Socrates makes a distinction between the philosopher and the lawyer. The lawyer is someone who presents a case in court, and the Athenians, like contemporary Americans, are very litigious people. And they presented cases in court, and they had to speak to the clock. You know, when you're speaking to a lawyer, that it costs money because time is money. So this time was measured in Athenian courts with a water clock where the water would flow through. When the thing was empty, your time was up. This was called a klepsydra, that literally stole time. So the lawyer is the person who speaks, who speaks to time, where time is money. So what is the philosopher? The philosopher is a person who has time, who takes time. I think that's the important distinction. So the freedom of the philosopher for Socrates consists in moving from topic to topic, or simply spending years returning to the same topic. To philosophize is to take your time. And this sounds, it is very simple, but it's a very deep thought, and it's a thought you can also find in Wittgenstein. He says, this is how philosophers should salute one another. Take your time. Take your time. So Socrates says that there are always those who are in the constant press of business: lawyers, policymakers, mortgage brokers, hedge fund managers, political leaders. But this not having time, which is kind of how we don't have time. We're always busy with one thing and another. But the philosopher has to take time, right? Has to take time, take their time, open something up. Socrates' argument is that if we don't take time, then we become small and shrewd in our souls, right? We become bent and crooked, he says. And now, this sounds kind of a little bit, dreamy, in the sense in which the philosopher is someone who takes time. But what that means is that the freedom of the philosopher is not circumscribed by the laws of the city, the mores and conventions that govern public life. The philosopher shows no respect for rank, for inherited privilege, and is unaware of anyone's high or low birth. It does not, I'm quoting Socrates here, it does not occur to the philosopher to join a political club or a political party. In thought, the philosopher is elsewhere. And this is the idea of the philosopher as absent-minded buffoon, right? But what's hidden in that, which is kind of the deeper point, this is that there is a real danger to this activity. Socrates is charged with impiety towards the gods, as I said, and with corrupting the youth of Athens. And on these charges, he was brought to court. He was brought to present himself as a lawyer in court. And he, of course, failed. He failed because he's a philosopher and not a lawyer. He was judged guilty, condemned to death, or given the option of ostracism, of leaving the city. But for Socrates, leaving the city of Athens would be worse than death. So he took the poison and took his life. And this whole question of the philosopher as paying for their impiety with their life has tracked through the history of philosophy. Figures like Giordano Bruno, Spinoza, Hume, and right the way down to the present. So what's the good of philosophy? Well, the good of philosophy is to create accusations of impiety, right? To call into question what other people don't want to call into question, whichever gods are the gods that govern the city, the state, the place at that time. Then the obligation, the good of philosophy, is to call them into question. And the price that Socrates pays for that is life. And Plato then constructs a whole incredibly complex literary enterprise based around that idea of the trial and the execution of Socrates. And so that's what philosophy is good for. Ultimately, it's taking your time and allowing yourself to experience the genuine freedom of thought, which occurs when you undertake the movement into perplexity about the basic issues that govern human affairs. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. That was, yeah, I really appreciated your talk. And yeah, I haven't thought about philosophy in quite this way in some time, going back to the Greek. So it's good for me to remember this. If you don't mind, I'll follow up with maybe a couple quick questions and we can have a chat.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the first one is that although there is this caricature, maybe it's meant to be a caricature of philosophy as clumsy when it comes to sort of worldly affairs. And it seems to be a caricature because the work you've done in the Stone and the extent to which philosophy questions pieties and engages in impiety seems like it's still connected to worldly affairs. And in some ways, to educate grown-ups, it has to be connected to world affairs. In a way, if the Stone is educating grown-ups, it's connected. So is that the idea that philosophy is clumsy is just, it's a caricature, it's a sketch, it's not really what philosophy is
Yeah, it's a caricature, it's a sketch. It's 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 that moment when in Mel Brooks's The History of the World Part 1, where people are registering for their, what's your profession? They go into a desk and saying what they do. You're a plumber or a painter. And the Mel Brooks character says, I'm a philosopher. I was like, okay, yeah, bullshit artist.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so in a sense, I think but that has to be, that caricature is a caricature, but I think it has to be maintained. The idea that philosophers are experts, are specialists, are people that can give policy advice, right? I think is a slippery slope. I think that in a sense that it's the persistent uselessness of philosophy which is useful. Of course, philosophy is in the world. Philosophy is in the city. And that's, I think, what we take from Socrates. Socrates' identity was completely bound up with the political life of the city. For him, it would be unimaginable to leave it. But he asks questions, but the thing to remember about philosophy is that unlike the history of the natural sciences, this has been going for 3,000 years now, at least. And there's no basic agreement on any basic question. Now, does that mean that philosophy is a fundamentally flawed activity because it doesn't give answers? Or is it the view that I would suggest, well, its duty, its good, is to ask questions and to kind of prick holes in the balloons that other people build. And so I think that activity remains constant. So when people in the world, as people do in the world, go about claiming to know things, to have superpowers, whether that's connected with driverless cars or AI, whatever it might be, then the good of the philosopher is to push at that. And to that extent, good journalists can be good philosophers too, just by asking the right questions. So yeah, it's a caricature, but a helpful caricature to remember.
Okay, great. Well, maybe I have one more question which is sort of related to philosophy as maybe a more academic discipline versus the sort of public-facing work that you've done. At some point, you were dismissive of the jargon of academic philosophy, but I know that you've engaged seriously in your academic work with philosophers who are known for academic jargon, Heidegger potentially, Levinas, some of these other figures.
Yes.
And it seems like you've learned things from them or understood, gained some kind of understanding, and then applied it to your work.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see the relationship between your more academic and scholarly stuff and the public work? Has it influenced it, or do you think these are just two separate exercises?
I think they're related. I think it's again, it's a kind of not a paradox, so maybe a tension is a better way of putting it. That again, if you go to Athens, or you look at a map of the ancient city of Athens, you see the city, the agora, the marketplace where people lived, the temples on the Acropolis, and then the academy, the academia, was a little bit outside the city, just outside the walls of the old city. And it was there in a privately funded institution, which Plato constructed with, if you like, with new money, with sponsorship money, that he built this institution to teach philosophy. And we don't really know much more about what happened in the academy. So what does that suggest? It suggests that there is a city and there is an academy, and there's a relationship between them. I don't think that it's I don't agree with the view that we need to kind of leave the academy and, you know, indulge in some fantasy of philosophy on the streets. I think that's delusional. I think you need to there's an extraordinary importance to the academy, to universities as places where everything can be questioned, where you can educate people in these very difficult systems of thought, often very technical language that's used. But I think it's important to remember that the identification of philosophy with academia is quite recent. I mean, the first philosopher who was really an academic in the modern sense was Kant. And Kant didn't really even teach philosophy. He taught meteorology and geography and various things like that. So this idea that philosophers are university-dwelling animals, I think is a modern idea. I'm not suggesting abandoning it, but we need to understand that, like with Plato's Academy, we exist in this space, which is a fantastic space to live in. It's an enormous privilege to get paid to think is an enormous privilege, and we do that alongside the city and with the interests of the city.
Great. So we're about out of time. So I'd just like to take this opportunity. Simon, thanks for participating in this benefit event. I appreciate it, and I'm sure my colleagues in Ukraine do too. I'd also like to thank the audience and everybody who's attending, and encourage people to contribute to establishing this Center for Civic Engagement in Ukraine, and to help students and scholars working in difficult conditions. Contribute what you can. It's every little bit helps. And Simon, thanks again. I enjoyed your talk, and I appreciate your support.
A noble enterprise, and I really wish you and everybody else involved with this all the best in the success of this. And I'm happy to contribute in any way that I'm able to. So best of luck.
Great. Thanks, Simon. Thanks everyone for attending this benefit conference for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the event is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis. My name is Aaron Wendland. I'm Vision Fellow in Public Philosophy at King's College London and the host of this event. It's worth saying that the purpose of this event is to generate the seed funding for a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. The center will support students, scholars, publicly engaged academics in Ukraine in their time of need. And I encourage any and everyone who's watching this to contribute to this cause. We'll give you a chance to do so after the talk. That said, it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Crane. Tim is professor of philosophy at the Central European University in Vienna. He was previously Knightsbridge Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge and Professor of Philosophy at University College London. His books include The Mechanical Mind, Elements of Mind, The Objects of Thought, Aspects of Psychologism, and The Meaning of Belief, Religion from Atheist's Point of View. Tim today will be talking about about philosophy as freedom of thought. And Tim, I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you. And it's in this conference. I'd like to say a few words about this theme. What good is philosophy? What good is philosophy in a time of crisis? And I'd like to start by saying a little bit about how I myself got into philosophy. I think, like many people, I encountered philosophy first through thinking about religion. I was brought up as a Roman Catholic, and I was very interested in the basis of Catholicism, and I wanted to understand the philosophical basis of it. And I found these strange books and these strange ideas and these interesting concepts that I couldn't understand. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it all. And that led me to philosophy. I think after a while, I was studying philosophy, and my religious interests and my religious commitment waned, as these things do in the cold light of reason. And I became interested in politics, and I looked to philosophy to play a certain sort of role in my life. And I think, like many people in their 20s, I was moralistic and sanctimonious about the world, and I wanted a way of justifying my politics. I wanted a way of justifying my moralizing and my condemnation of everyone. I wanted a philosophical refutation of Margaret Thatcher. This was my ambition as a student. So I looked to philosophy for this, and of course, if you look to philosophy for anything, you'll find it somewhere. And I found, all sorts of justifications for the views that I held. As time went on, as my political views became more nuanced or complex or compromised, and my interest in philosophy moved to other things, and I became interested in the nature of the mind and in metaphysics and in the philosophy of language. And I started to realize something else, and it took me some time to realize this, which was that philosophy shouldn't ask for an external justification. Philosophy doesn't need an external justification, and it's bad for philosophy to think that it has to have such a justification. Philosophy isn't good for anything in that sense, except for what it is. It's good. It's something that we need. It's something that not everyone needs, but it's something that our culture needs. And for that, it doesn't need to be justified in terms of anything other than itself. And it took me some time to realize the simple truth of this. People say, what do you understand by philosophy? And the definition, if it is one, the definition of philosophy that I like the best is the famous one from Wilfrid Sellars, when Sellars said that philosophy is the attempt to explain how things, in the most general sense of the word, hang together in the most general sense of the word. I think the attempt to understand, maybe. So I think philosophy is an attempt at understanding. And it's an attempt to understand how things hang together. It's an attempt to understand the world as a whole, or the world in some of its aspects. In its my own attempts to understand the mind as a whole, the human mind, animal minds, what it is to me, what it means to have a mind. These are the philosophical questions. So these are theoretical questions. They're questions about our understanding. And they're questions that have an intrinsic value, or rather, the answers to these questions will have an intrinsic value for us. They shouldn't have a value which is justified or explained in terms of anything else. So this is how I think of philosophy. I think of it as the most general way to understand things and how things hang together. And hanging together, so this definition is vague, because hanging together isn't explained. There's no explanation of hanging together, but you kind of know it when you see it and what hanging together is, or what people are trying to do when they aim to describe how things hang together. So this isn't just metaphysics. This is about the ethical nature of the world, the political nature of the world, the value-laden nature of the world. This is all part of how things hang together in the most general sense. Now, in saying this, I don't mean that philosophy should not be engaged. And I think that the recent move towards engaged philosophy, which I hope I've tried to play some part in myself. I wrote, my most recent book was a book about religious belief, which was an attempt to raise in a philosophical way questions about religious belief which were in the public sphere. So it was an attempt to engage in those public debates. And I think philosophy has made huge steps in recent years in engaging in public debates, and that's incredibly important. And I value it enormously, and I'd like to do more myself. What I'm worried about in the engagement of philosophy is the kind of rebirth of the kind of political use of philosophy that I employed when I was a callow student. What I mean by that is that while philosophy has become engaged, and its engagement is a good thing, it's also become ideological. And a lot of engaged philosophy has become ideological. What I mean by that is that it's become committed as a philosophical starting point to certain ways of settling questions. That certain other ways of settling questions are completely unacceptable. There are many examples of this now. I think the gender debate is one of them, where there cannot actually be a genuine debate in certain areas, because it's a matter of stating which side you're on, whether you're in favor of certain kinds of people, or whether you're in favor of other kinds of people, whether you belong here or you belong there. And this kind of identification with a group, an in-group and an out-group, is something that's, I think of as deeply ideological, and also it's a component in religious belief, which is not a criticism. I'm just saying it's not philosophy. Once you have that kind of commitment to a particular way where you cannot even explain to the other side why you disagree with them, where it's not even permitted to explain that, because even raising the question is out of the question, then I think we've lost something in philosophy. Now, I could mention many examples here, but my point is actually a more general one. It's a general one about how engaged philosophy thinks of its role. Should engaged philosophy think of itself as primarily a kind of advocacy for a certain kind of view? Should it be a way to provide a priori or conceptual or metaphysical or some other kind of justification for things that you believe already? Is that what it's for? Or should engaged philosophy be a genuine attempt to do what philosophy does, which is to explain how things, in the most general sense of the word, hang together? And that might involve exploring options which you don't find attractive, exploring options which are no part of your worldview, trying to understand why people think other than they do. I think in non-political areas of philosophy, this is perfectly intelligible. So metaphysics, we consider all sorts of lunatic views. We consider the view that time is unreal. We consider the view that there are no composite objects. We consider the view that the world might be wholly mental in nature. We consider the view that there is only one thing. We consider all these views. One of the things we're trying to do and consider these views is not just repeat what we think, because if I told you what I think, it would be totally boring. I'd say there are many kinds of objects. Time is real. There isn't just one thing. There aren't just atoms in the void. There are many other things. These are my views, and they're perfectly boring. Right? What's interesting here is not the views themselves or even the truth itself, but why would anyone think otherwise? This is the question you have to ask yourself. Why would anyone think otherwise? Of course, time is real. Time is the most real thing. We live in time. How could time fail to be real? So why did anyone think otherwise? Why would any serious thinker put forward the view that time is unreal? I feel that this is something that we're lacking in the other debates, and something that I tried to do in my religion book. My book is called The Meaning of Belief, from religion from an atheist point of view. I'm an atheist myself. But what my question is, rather than pick holes in all the arguments that theologians and philosophers have put forward for and against the existence of God, for example, I'm interested in the question, given I'm an atheist, but why do people think otherwise? What is it about this worldview that grabs most of the world? When I say this worldview, and then I'm talking huge, I'm generalizing over huge numbers of people, but this is what we do when we talk about philosophy. And in philosophy, we will generalize, and we ask ourselves, why does anyone think otherwise? And this is what's lacking, I think, from a lot of the politically engaged philosophy I see today. I feel in a way that it's part of the problem here is political philosophy itself, the way political philosophy has developed. And it's developed as a investigation, very sophisticated investigation into the interaction between a small number of concepts or phenomena. I don't really distinguish concepts and phenomena in this sense, between the interaction between justice, equality, liberty, or freedom. How do these things interact? Justice, equality, and liberty. The incredibly sophisticated work that's done in political philosophy around these concepts risks losing sight of the central question of philosophy, which is, or one of the central questions as I see it, which is, why does anyone think otherwise? John Rawls begins his book, The Theory of Justice, by saying that justice is the first virtue of politics. Who would deny that? And if they do, why do they deny it? And it seems to me that in our current predicament, particularly the predicament that leads us into the dire and tragic situation that people in Ukraine are facing at the moment, cannot be understood if we conceptualize it in terms of concepts like liberty, equality, and justice. We're not going to get anywhere if we condemn what's happening as unjust or against equality. We have to understand what's going on. And this will involve understanding not just philosophical ideas, and much more than philosophical ideas. And there may be very little philosophy can say here. But one thing for example, and here I'll take an example from my former colleague Raymond Goyce in Cambridge, would always ask that the question which liberal political philosophy is ignoring is the question of power, and what power is, and how it's being exercised, and how can power be legitimate. Of course, liberal political philosophy does have its way of answering questions about legitimacy, but the fundamental phenomenon of politics, seems to me, is power, as Hobbes saw. And it's something which I feel is just sort of skated over or brushed to one side in the whole question of the sort of the dance around the various concepts, by which I don't mean to be dismissive, because these are very, very important works by people who talk about liberty and equality and democracy, justice. But there's more to politics than this. And I think the narrowing of political philosophy combined with the moralism of a lot of engaged philosophy has led to a very impoverished kind of sense of what political life is about, and a very impoverished understanding of what our world situation is at the moment. Very little of it is about liberty and equality and questions of justice, I believe. Maybe that's controversial, but let me give you an example of the way I think that the danger of philosophy that here, the one danger is the danger of moralism. The other danger is the danger of specialization, and thinking that questions can only be dealt with by the experts. Now, one of my favorite papers in political philosophy, and I don't identify here as a political philosopher, but one of my favorite papers in political philosophy is Harry Frankfurt's paper, Equality is a Moral Ideal. When I first read this paper, I was so struck by it. In this paper, Frankfurt questions whether equality as such is a value. And of course, this has led to a lot of discussion and huge literature and everything, but the paper itself is simple, beautiful, clear, and it answers the question. It addresses that question: why does anyone think otherwise? When I spoke to a colleague of mine who was a political philosopher, he said I said, well, what do people think of this paper in philosophy, political philosophy? Because this seems to me one of the greatest papers I've read in recent years. And he said, well, people felt that Harry Frankfurt wasn't really a political philosopher, so he wasn't really entitled to weigh in this dispute. Now that was a slightly frivolous remark by my colleague, but I think it pointed to something, which is the idea that you have experts, and within the field you have these experts who've worked on these things, and they're the people who can direct others. And this is a bad model for philosophy. A philosopher ought to be able to come in and say, what the hell is going on here? Why are you starting from these assumptions? Why is this the important starting place? Why is this the important concept? This is what a philosopher should be able to say. And to do that, you have to step aside from expertise. You have to step aside from the idea that I know all the literature on this subject, but you have to be able to just ask that, possibly the emperor's new clothes question. And maybe it's a stupid question, and maybe it's an easy question to answer. But there has to be someone asking those questions. If we don't ask those questions, then philosophy becomes just a mobilization of various ideologies battling against each other and shouting at each other across the void. And I think we see this in certain areas now. So I think the way to move forward here is to think what it is that we're doing in philosophy. So in particular, in the case of political philosophy, Bernard Williams once remarked that a lot of political philosophy sees itself as applied moral philosophy. Where the problems that we're trying to solve are moral problems, it's just at the level of nations or societies. And I think that's a great insight, because that was a very critical insight by Williams, and I think it was a great insight because that's actually the way I was taught. I remember thinking this: what you do is you just scale up from the moral case to the political case, and you think of everything in moral terms. Because of that, you fail to understand a lot of the reality of politics. Of course, you can condemn people. You can condemn people as much as you like, and you can have very good arguments for condemning them, but you won't understand them, and you won't understand the situation. So this is why I think that although the contemporary move towards engaged philosophy is one of the great things in our discipline at the moment. And I think as the other parts of the discipline are becoming very scholastic and rather wooden, and even exhibiting what Imre Lakatos called the features of a degenerating research program, going round and round in circles in small questions that make no progress. I think engaged philosophy is an area that is making huge progress. Progress in our understanding. This is what we want. But the danger of engaged philosophy is that it becomes ideological. And once philosophy has become ideological, then it's lost. And this is how things were in the Soviet Union. This is how things were in the former communist states. There was an ideological philosophy, and that's what people were taught in philosophy. They were taught the ideology. My own university is the Central European University here in Vienna. Is founded by the billionaire philanthropist George Soros, who was inspired by Karl Popper's concept of an open society. The open society Popper wrote about in these two books, very polemical books, were a denunciation of the idea that there is one way of thinking in a society. An open society should be a society where there isn't just one way of thinking. And philosophy should be open in this sense. Philosophy shouldn't be ideological. And this is why I think Wittgenstein said, or this is how I interpret Wittgenstein's remark, that the philosopher is not a citizen of a community of ideas. And I think in this respect, he was right.
Thanks very much, Tim. Thanks for your talk. If you don't mind, I have a couple quick sort of follow-up questions. One is particular on the relationship between philosophy and ideology. And the way I want to kind of come in on the question, I'm not sure I've quite worked it out, but what is the relationship between philosophy and truth and ideology and truth, because I could imagine that there is this point for asking questions and there's a point of exploration and freedom and creativity. But presumably one of the reasons you want that is to get to something like the truth, or in your words, to understand the way things hang together. But if we've understood the way things hang together in, say, politics or morality, if we have understood it, does that mean we've gone to the realm of ideology? Or I'm not sure if that's the right way to put the question. But my worry was that in the description of philosophy as sort of almost open-ended free inquiry, is it, if through this open-ended inquiry you've gotten to the truth of something, then that should motivate some kind of action based on that truth in either politics or the moral sphere. But does that then run the risk of becoming ideology? I'm not sure I've given the clear question, but
No,
do you understand my concern here?
I understand what you're saying, Aaron. I think if I could just perhaps start with the analogy with metaphysics, because I think
Sure.
it's less obvious there, because that doesn't engage people's feelings and emotions so much. To me, finding out the truth in certain things in metaphysics is not the issue. To me, the issue, I mean, the certain truths that are simply obvious, right? Now, that isn't true for everything, and certain things you discover, and there are complexities, and there are complex truths you find out. But certain kind of simple truths, if I want to know, does the world depend on my current experience of it? For me, I'm absolutely convinced, there's absolutely no question that the world does not depend on my current experience of it. So what's the point then in philosophizing about this? What's the point in teaching your students the views of idealists and phenomenalists and or skeptics? Epistemology is another example. A skeptic comes along and says, you don't know anything. If I know anything at all, I know that I know something, right? This is the opposite of the sort of Socratic position, right? I of course I know stuff. Of course I do. So skepticism can't be a position that anyone should take seriously. Now, one response would be to say, well, just let's not discuss skepticism. And this is, some philosophers have this view. Another response would be to say, well, what's going on with skepticism? What's the point? What point is being gained? So what we're trying to do here is not just get at the truth, but we're trying to understand our place in this complex connection of ideas and assumptions. And I think the same is true in the moral and political sphere. I mean, I have no doubt about certain moral beliefs that I have. I mean, sometimes it seems to me absurd that I listen to lectures where moral philosophers are trying to provide some argument for why you should not torture people or you should not kill babies or something like this. I mean, how could you think that this was an important thing to do, to give an argument for something that's so obvious? So if you think that's not an important thing to do, what is the philosophical thing? Well, it's the point you mentioned, which is the point about understanding. I feel what we need is to understand why we're asking the questions that we're asking, and understand what the range of possible answers are, and understand, as I said, why anyone would think otherwise. Now, that is entirely compatible and consistent with having a very strong view about what the ethical and moral positions are in the world. Just as investigating skepticism or idealism or phenomenalism in metaphysics is compatible with having a very absolutely convinced view. Right? I'm not waiting to be persuaded by the skeptic, or I'm not waiting to be, just as I'm not waiting to be persuaded by the moral philosopher that torture is wrong. Nothing will persuade me that torture is acceptable. So what am I doing? What are we doing when we're talking about torture? Well, then there's a long story. But I think this is why I think what I'm talking about, I mean, I'm not against people being ideologically committed or people being politically active, but let's not confuse that with philosophy, because once we do, that will kill philosophy.
Okay, excellent. I really appreciate it. I think that's a great place to end. So, Tim, thanks so much for participating in this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. I really appreciate it. I'm sure my Ukrainian colleagues do too. I also want to thank all the viewers, and I encourage you to contribute to this initiative if you can. I will give everyone a few minutes to contribute and support academics, students, and scholars in Ukraine. And again, thanks very much, Tim. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It was really great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for attending this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis. And the aim is to generate the seed funding to establish a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. And the center will support students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine in their time of great need. I encourage everybody who's participating in this event to contribute what they can to this initiative. And with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Mychailo Wynnyckyj. Mychailo teaches at the National University, Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and was recently appointed Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies. Until early 2022, he served as head of the Secretariat of Ukraine's National Agency for Higher Education Quality Assurance, and prior to that, as an advisor to 3 of Ukraine's ministers of education. Today, Mychailo will be speaking with us about Grappling with Evil, an intellectual delineation of war, atrocity, and attempted genocide. Mychailo, to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And actually, I want to thank everyone for joining this conference. And indeed, as Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, I'd like to express gratitude on behalf of our university community to all those who've supported Kyiv Mohyla in the past, and to good people around the world that support Ukraine's fight for freedom, independence, and indeed the survival of our nation in the face of Russia's aggression. During the past year, countless students, faculty, and alumni of Kyiv Mohyla Academy have enlisted for military service in the armed forces, territorial defense, National Guard, and are serving in special operations. Others have volunteered their time, effort, and financial and intellectual resources to the war effort. We've all heeded the call to defend our communities, our families, and our freedoms from the destruction and genocide that Russian aggression has brought to Ukraine. We honor those who've made the ultimate sacrifice so that we may live. Public service is really at the core of the ethic of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. We were founded in 1615. Our history has been tied intimately to the history of Ukraine. Mazepa, Sahaydachny, Petro Mohyla, Pavlo Polubotok, Grigory Skovroda, all of these names, which may not be household names in North America, but certainly are very well known for all Ukrainians, all of them were Mohylyanці. During the past 30 years, since the collapse of the USSR, Kyiv Mohyla Academy has been a mainstay of democratic values, free speech, and academic excellence. Our university was the birthplace of multiple protest movements aimed at moving Ukraine closer to its European civilizational home, and in 2 cases, these movements became popular revolutions, in 2004 and in 2013-14. Each of these events transformed the country in its own way. Each affected Ukraine's geopolitical orientation, the discourse of its population, and the identity of its elites. Without hyperbole, Kyiv Mohyla Academy is the intellectual center of Ukraine. I'd like to illustrate this claim with a translated quote from, strange as it may sound, a Russian right-wing chauvinist. His name is Innokenty Andreev. He's an ideologue who laid the groundwork for Putin's invasion of Ukraine and contributed to the false narrative according to which Ukrainians and Russians are supposedly one nation. He's one of the authors of the imperialist ideology known as Ruski Mir, or Russian world. And this quote is from an article published in 2006 under the title, Russian Language as Shield and Sword. So I quote, "A project is currently being implemented in Ukraine that is capable in the future of nullifying Russia's influence there in the intellectual sphere. This project is called Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Teaching at this university is conducted in Ukrainian and English. High-quality teaching of the English language makes it possible, in principle, for students and researchers not to resort to Russian sources, which may eventually result in the removal of all advanced disciplines from the mainstream of post-Soviet academia and synchronize them with modern intellectual trends in the West." End quote. When a Russian imperialist author attributes blame to Kyiv Mohyla Academy for being a leader in shifting Ukraine away from the post-Soviet space, and Russia specifically, to the intellectual traditions of Europe and the world, I feel proud to have now been part of this university for over 20 years. Without exaggeration, Kyiv Mohyla Academy is one of the key pillars of Ukraine's intellectual and social development. And I say this today because our conference is about public philosophy and civic engagement. Perhaps immodestly, I would like to challenge any other university to compare its own engagement with the civic life of its community and impact on the development of its nation to that of Kyiv Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. We are engaged. Indeed, some would say we are responsible. With this partisan, obviously pro-Ukrainian position in mind, I would like to make a few comments on a topic that I've been grappling with since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion: the question of the existence of evil. Indeed, to quote some authors, I would call my topic an attempt to deal with the riddle of evil, as opposed to the more traditional problem of evil. What has come to be known as the problem of evil has a long philosophical history, generally informed by religious teachings. What is known as theodicy involves addressing this question: how do we reconcile the obvious existence of evil with belief in an all-knowing, all-powerful, and most importantly, fully benevolent God? Perhaps the best-known work on the topic was written by the rationalist philosopher Leibniz, who proposed that the world that God created, though imperfect because of his having granted humans free will, was the best of all possible worlds and therefore consistent with God's benevolence. This conclusion is problematic for a whole host of reasons, but let's leave them aside for now. Unlike Leibniz, I would like to treat the question of the existence or non-existence of evil not from the perspective of a believer, but rather using scholastic or secular methods. Furthermore, I note that the question of whether evil exists as a separate force, having independent agency, or as a deficiency, as Aquinas had it, or universal quality of every human, as Kant claimed, is not a question that is to be considered theoretical, philosophically abstract, or even in any way removed from everyday life. In the Ukraine that I experienced very personally, from late February to early May of last year, evil was very much present in our everyday lives. At that time, my family heard Russian artillery on the outskirts of Kyiv, and we learned to distinguish the sound of a 155 millimeter howitzer from a Hrad multiple launch rocket system. For us, evil was not an intellectualized idea or even an arguably fabricated mystical concept. Its instantiation in aggression, destruction, and death was very real. As we found out later, our experience was mild. Russian soldiers raped children in nearby Bucha. Russian occupiers murdered civilians in Mariupol and in towns and villages throughout the southern, eastern, and northern regions that experienced occupation. The Russians committed atrocities in Izium, Kherson, Irpin, and countless other towns and cities throughout Ukraine. Were these actions not evil? According to last year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, Alexandra Matvichuk, incidentally a Kyiv Mohyla graduate, during 10 months of 2022, spanning March to December, the Center for Civil Liberties, the NGO that she heads, documented over 30,000 cases of war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. The scale of atrocity is breathtaking. What can be its cause? What's the nature of this evil? Does it possess all humans and therefore represents the dark side of the natural human condition? Or instead is evil a symptom of human imperfection? In other words, a disease, one that, like all diseases, is eventually curable. How we answer these questions has both far-reaching and very immediate consequences. If evil is a deficiency and humans are fundamentally good, then there is no moral ground to consider all Russian occupiers guilty or responsible for Ukraine's suffering. Culpability should be extended only to those who actually committed crimes that cannot be atoned for. Indeed, according to the view that humans are fundamentally good and that evil is simply a disease, even perpetrators of the worst atrocities should be given the opportunity to rehabilitate. Only those who do not repent, or rather cannot be healed, should be punished. This humanistic position, irrespective of its obvious Christian roots, the idea of turn the other cheek, represents a foundational belief underpinning modern values. Since Augustine and Aquinas, Western philosophy has preached that evil is simply the absence of good, that evil has no separate ontology, in the same way as cold does not actually exist, but is merely the absence of heat. So too is evil an absence of good. Hegel and Heidegger supported this claim. For them, evil is privation, deficiency, a condition that is treatable with education, information, counseling, rehabilitation. According to this view, evil has no independent existence. Evil can exist only because of the inadequacy of the human will, as sin or error. It can be treated by medication, education, correction. Sometimes individuals deviate from their natural state of goodness due to psychological illness, social neglect, inequality, and they do things that are not good. Then they should be helped to right their ways. The above, what I've just said, is the view that underpins the Western, or at least modern European and North American cultural order. When we declare human rights to be universal, all life to be valued, all individuals worthy of respect, in other words, when we argue in favor of the self-evident philosophical foundations of the institutional order we take for granted, we propagate a fundamental assumption that people are fundamentally good. Now here's the problem. They're not. Russian soldiers in Ukraine have massacred civilians on their own initiative, without direct orders to do so. Russian soldiers have raped and murdered women, smashed the heads of infants, castrated POWs. Russian field commanders regularly order indiscriminate attacks on civilian houses, schools, hospitals. Why Russians engage in such barbarism is beyond comprehension if one accepts established paradigms. This is not about sin or error. These war crimes have not been perpetrated by individuals who are fundamentally good, but who have erred. These actions are evil. Russian barbarism cannot be healed or rectified. This is not a deficiency. This is a real manifestation of evil, one that the ethical theories on which Western civilization is based simply have difficulty comprehending. I turn to the eminent philosopher Immanuel Kant, who asserted that every human being has an innate propensity to radical evil. Based on my experience, this seems to be a more credible position, though much less comfortable upon introspection. Kant believed that the propensity for radical evil was a consequence of human beings' capacity for free choice. While we have the capacity to choose to act ethically, by which he meant rationally and with respect for autonomy and dignity of the other, we also have the capacity to act out of self-interest. And controversially, Kant stated that our propensity towards radical evil is a universal characteristic of human nature. It cannot be eliminated entirely. Again, not a particularly comfortable assertion when one places it in the mirror. However, Kant also believed that we have the capacity to overcome or stifle our propensity towards radical evil. By using reason to understand ethical principles and by practicing moral actions, we can develop the habit of acting out of a sense of duty and respect for others, and thus overcome our natural propensity towards radical evil. Well, that position is comforting. It forms the basis for a personal ethic to be followed by each of us who strives to live a moral life, to stifle any evil that might exist within us. But Kant's ethical guidance to ourselves provides little help for understanding empirically observable evil in others. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the author of the famous Gulag Archipelago, seems to have echoed Kant's position and explained its pitfalls. I quote, "If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. It is, after all, only because of the way things worked out that they were the executioners and we weren't." End quote. Lately, we've heard many voices calling for an end to this war. Certainly, peace is desirable. The killing and destruction should stop. However, for Ukrainians, the peace that eventually follows this war must be a just peace. Universally, Ukrainians believe that the evil that we have faced must be punished, smashed so that it will not threaten us again. And here we are confronted with a problem. For any peacemaker to admit that one of the parties is evil, lacking good, and the other good, lacking evil or at least culpability for crimes, would amount to failure. The intermediary position would be compromised. But more importantly, the foundational values on which Western institutions are built would be undermined because people are essentially good, so says the dominant paradigm. Some measure of good and evil must be present in both sides of any conflict. Each side is said to have interests that reflect its own interpretations of what is good. The job of a mediator is therefore to find balance between the conflicting parties, to recognize the legitimacy of the interests of each side. In this view, war is never cast as a conflict of good versus evil. Its essence is a differentiation in interpretations of good. War is seen as a disastrous form of misunderstanding. Differences between the warring sides can be healed because both are fundamentally seen as good, or at least more or less equally mistaken. Hence, to mediate means to balance, to be impartial, publicly neutral, because both sides have sinned or allowed their inherent evil side to dominate. They must be prompted to see the error of their ways. In the present case, good must be assumed to be present in the actions of Russia, and some evil, mistakes that can be rectified, present on the Ukrainian side. Understandably, this search for balance elicits outrage in Ukraine. Many Ukrainians are asking, when will the world wake up to the evil that is Russia and its regime? Why does the international community insist upon balance when this war is clearly black and white? When will we stop blaming the victim? The very possibility of these questions requires a rethink, in the first place in the West, of foundational beliefs, a recalibration of the paradigm on which international institutions have been constructed. That's not an easy thing to do, but it must be done. Evil must be recognized for what it is and destroyed. In 1946, the International Military Tribunal, which was established at Nuremberg after World War II to prosecute war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity, stated that aggression is the, quote, supreme international crime because it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, end quote. By referring to the accumulated evil of the whole, the judges of the tribunal were referring to the harm and suffering that aggression causes not only to the targeted state and its people, but to the entire international community. The harm caused by aggression reverberates through the international system, leading to further conflicts, instability, and suffering. Indeed, I would claim this reverberation also affects the philosophical foundations of what we call Western civilization. The very public brutality of Russia's soldiers in Ukraine, and the very fact that Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is engaging in an unprovoked war of aggression, these are not just appalling facts that are to be politically and economically sanctioned. Russia's political leadership has committed the crime of aggression, and its orders have been enacted with vigor by its soldiers and supported by its population. To claim that this is a result of brainwashing by state media or that the Russians have been duped into being cruel is to claim that their fundamentally good essences have been infected. This seems, as a minimum, a stretch. Certainly to those who lived through occupation or witnessed the destruction of war firsthand, the portrayal of Russian military personnel as having even traces of good is problematic. Throughout the past year and for 8 years previously, since 2014, Russian forces, individual soldiers, have been vigorously and passionately destroying Ukrainians and all things Ukrainian in the areas that they have occupied. It seems difficult to see these actions as reflecting the belief that humans, though capable of error, are fundamentally good. Peace will, of course, someday come to Ukraine, and Russian war criminals will be prosecuted. If there is good in every person, as the Augustinian and Aquinian tradition would have us believe, or instead there is evil in every person, as Kant and Solzhenitsyn would have it, Should the defense, "I was just following orders," be considered sufficient to excuse the perpetrators of atrocities? After all, according to this paradigm, evil and good are characteristics of the human will, which can act ethically or in error. But when an action is not willful, logically, it cannot be good or evil. Can an individual who acted without intent be held responsible for heinous crimes? 20 years ago, in the wake of atrocities committed by Serbs in Bosnia, similar arguments were made to justify the limitation of prosecutions by the International Criminal Court to those giving the orders. There's another solution to the riddle of evil, but it is not particularly pleasing to those of us seeking understanding, peace, and justice. If we see evil as having a separate existence from the human actor, then we may claim that the perpetrators of atrocities were somehow possessed and therefore not responsible, a defense analogous to the idea of temporary insanity. On the positive side, such a position would provide conceptual space for a future peace between Russia and Ukraine. After the personified evil has been destroyed and its supposedly possessed victims released, the innocent people of Russia and Ukraine can live in peace. When I was writing the abstract for today's contribution, Aaron responded to an initial draft by suggesting a separate agency or independent ontology for evil. I was arguing explicitly that the crimes perpetrated by Russia and Russians in Ukraine are somehow guided by Satan or the devil. I assure you that's not what I'm arguing. In the same way as I believe we need a secular account of ethics and morality, thank you Kant, Russell, and many others, we need a secular explanation for evil. Evil not as a transgression or error, but evil as a driver of action, of what we sociologists call agency. In a mystic world, that agency would be anthropomorphized in a devil or Satan figure. But we're not mystics. But what it would seem the problem remains. What is the quality and where is the agency of evil? I'm afraid that today I have posed more questions than answers, but that too is the job of a public intellectual, to voice the thoughts and fears underlying public discourse. During the past year, Ukrainians have experienced evil firsthand. As Europeans, educated and accultured in a humanistic ethic, we have seen and felt an agency of that which we cannot explain. Russian barbarism and spiteful cruelty in Ukraine is beyond comprehension. For the time being, we are coping with this problem, or with this riddle, by dehumanizing the enemy. We call them orcs, rachists, a version of fascists, muskali. But the war will end, and they will again be our neighbors. How will we move forward? How will we coexist? Who or what will we agree is guilty for what has been done and why? Clearly, the extent of destruction, callousness, and brutality will require compensation and prolonged healing. But do we actually understand what in fact needs to be healed? I fear that without a profound philosophical understanding of the roots of the evil agency that Ukrainians have suffered through during this war, the phrase "never again," which supposedly was to be the unifying slogan for elites and institutions after World War II, will yet again ring hollow at some point in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mychailo. Thank you very much for an impassioned and intellectually stimulating talk. If you don't mind, I will follow up maybe with one or two sort of quick questions to potentially push you a little bit on developing this positive alternative to the current European understanding of evil and the basis upon which our assumptions about human goodness serve as explanations or foundations for our existing institutions. So if I understood you correctly, the current model is a form of evil as a form of sickness or something that can be cured. We all have a little bit of it, but we're all fundamentally good. If we do away with that model, I suppose the question is, what is the model that you have? You had mentioned choice, and evil is a function of choice. If that is the question, what bearing does that have on sort of our institutions? Or maybe a nice way to put my question is, what is the alternative paradigm you're developing or you think we need instead of the current paradigm that we have?
Thanks, Aaron. I think that I'm not sure I have an answer that is, a fully developed answer. And at the end of the day, I have to admit that I'm more sociologist than philosopher. But I think it's important for us to understand that in the same way as the concept of agency was once attributed to individuals, and in sociology has now become attributed also to collectivities, meaning movements, corporations, these types of things. When we talk about evil as something that is a driving force for action, it doesn't necessarily have to be a characteristic of the individual as a if you like, a carrier of agency or a person of free will. Traditionally, that is how we've been looking at evil. Evil and good have been characteristics of individuals. But at the same time, we can, and characteristics of actions of those individuals. But if we now look at collective action and we look at something that is happening, be it at an institutional level, at a national level, at the level of an organization called an army, obviously actions are still individually based, but they are very often driven by an agency that is not individual at all. Now, that means that agency becomes abstract. And if we now talk about the fact that evil and good are characteristics of an abstract agency, then we have a problem of where is it housed? Do we go back to this sort of idea of, that goes back to mysticism and early Christianity, where supposedly evil is housed in a devil or Satan that now possesses individuals? Or can we talk about something that's a little bit more complex, meaning a characteristic of a collective agency or a corporate agency? This causes problems because then the issue is, do we now attribute collective responsibility? Because if we have a collective agency, then presumably we can also talk about a collective responsibility. But our institutions are always based on individual responsibility. Crimes and punishment are always individual rather than collective. So I'm not sure that I have an answer to you, except to say that the issue that we're experiencing today is an obvious collective force, meaning that evil and good are characteristics of collectivities and not or corporations or nations or group actions. And if they're group actions, then the evil and the good as characteristics of those actions needs to have another basis other than just individualism.
Right. Okay. Good. So something, not to lean too hard on the use of spiritual here, but there's something like, in the spirit of a people, the spirit has agency of the people, and that can be evil in certain instances.
Precisely. I think that I've been someone that has experienced in Ukraine, living in Ukraine for the last 20 years, I've experienced 2 revolutions and now a war. I certainly understand the concept of collective agency. When we were protesting on the Maidan, when the Ukrainians are volunteering, when we have these grassroots movements, which are something that I study and I become absolutely enamored and fascinated with, we're talking about a collective agency. Of course, the agency is enacted through the actions of individuals, but those individual actions don't have any kind of force unless they have a collectivity behind them. So we can talk about a collective agency, and if we can talk about a collective agency, that we can also say that that agency has a characteristic of being ethical and working by rules, or being evil and therefore working by different rules. What we're seeing in the actions of Russian soldiers in Ukraine, I would say, is a collective agency. Now, the problem, of course, is where's the collective responsibility? And that now becomes an institutional problem that is an interpretation of our philosophical foundations of Western civilization.
Right. Fantastic. And I guess the idea would be, in the new paradigm you're developing, that this collective agent is not capable of being healed. It's not sick. It's something else.
Perhaps it is capable of being healed, but it's not being capable of being healed in the same way as we would heal an individual. In other words, it's not through individual education. It's not through individual responsibilities and then prison terms and those types of things. We need to be thinking in different ways as to how we cope with this problem of collective agency that we find objectionable and obviously capable of atrocity in today's world.
Excellent. Mychailo, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. I know you have lots of demands on your time, not least running a university in Ukraine at the moment. So thank you again, and I want to thank all the attendees and listeners. I encourage you to contribute to this initiative to support academics and scholars like Mychailo working in Ukraine under very challenging circumstances. And thanks very much for your time, and we'll leave it there.
Thank you. I want to actually take this opportunity, Aaron. I'm not sure that everybody else, the other speakers, have thanked you for your initiative. It is very much appreciated. Kyiv Mohyla Academy as a center of intellectual vibrancy, I think, is something that we're very grateful to the multiple supporters that we have in the world. And Aaron is one of those multiple supporters that is giving his time, his effort, and his organizational skills to put this event together. And we very much appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for attending this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis, and it's meant to generate support for establishing a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. This center will provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who are doing excellent work under very difficult circumstances. We'll put some information up on the screen after this session in order to enable you to contribute, and we encourage you to give what you can. That said, it's my honor to welcome Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, Yulia Kovaliv. She will be delivering the closing remarks at this benefit event. Yulia is Ukraine's ambassador to Canada. Before becoming an ambassador, she was deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, where she was responsible for economic policy and development. She also served as Deputy Secretary of the National Investment Council of Ukraine. And from 2015 to 2016, she was the first Deputy Minister for Economic Development and Trade. She holds a master's degree in economics from Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and she is the proud mother of 2 children. Yulia, it's an honor to have you here, and today Yulia will be speaking a little bit about defending democracy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you everybody who participated in this first major benefit conference. What good is philosophy and the role of the Academy in a time of crisis? And we really are living in a time of crisis. In the time when the core values and the core beliefs that makes us all the citizens of the world live happily has been challenged. And Russia has been challenging the single principles of democracy, the principles of the international rule-based order and the human rights. But Russia has already strategically lost in Ukraine. And each and every Ukrainian, whether it's the doctor, journalist, whether it's the scientist, whether it's the teacher or the student, has been fighting for our country. But indeed, this fight is much bigger because the outcome of the Russian full-scale aggression will also shape the way how the world will look like in the decades ahead. And it will take what it takes from every of us Ukrainians to secure the victory for Ukraine. And we are very grateful for support of many people around the world, from the government of our partners and allies, and from each and single personality who were standing with Ukraine, who was helping, donating Ukraine as we are fighting this war for all of us. And let's be also frank, we also should not undermine the importance of human intellectual capacity in the post-war period for Ukraine, because such a human capital will be very beneficial for Ukraine to rebuild the country after the war. And sadly, the academics who stayed in Ukraine and have been conducting their research, and they are teaching and providing the public service in a very challenging circumstances. The world has witnessed the pictures and the video of Ukrainian teachers who just from the front line, using their mobile phones and computers, has been conducting the lessons for their children at school and for the students in the university, because each of them understands the value of education, the value of science, and the value of bringing up the new generation of Ukrainians who will be working and living in a rebuilt country. But unfortunately, Russian aggression to Ukraine has brought a lot of challenges to our education. 7,000 scholars have unfortunately fled Ukraine, and thousands more have been displaced within the country as Russia launched full-scale invasion. To the date, over 170 colleges and universities in Ukraine have been damaged, and more than 20 of them have been completely destroyed. And I want to, first of all, express my gratitude to Ukrainian armed forces. for their enormous efforts every day to liberate each meter and each square kilometer of Ukrainian territory. And many of these members of Ukrainian armed forces are coming from the academia sector. That are the teachers, that are the researchers, and that are the students, the young students who should have been educating this time and who should have spent their time in universities. But instead of that, they are spending their time in trenches, protecting our country and protecting the democracy all over the world. I'm also proud to be the alumni of Kyiv Mohyla University. And I can assure you that for the last 3 decades of the modern Ukrainian history, the Academy has been serving our country as a center of civic development and has an important impact on the social, political, and cultural life in the modern and new Ukraine, and uniting the efforts of opinion leaders toward reforming Ukraine and towards changing our society. And I would like to thank you, organizers of this conference, for the important contribution to support the Ukrainian academic sector, to support Kyiv Mohyla Academy, because for the university to live through the time of the war and keep their students, keep their teachers, keep their researchers working from the basements, from the shelters, under the missile attack, without the electricity, sometimes without the access of the basic needs. But the important thing, the academia is keeping on education, because the education, as we see in this war, is a very important tool for us, both to share with the world for what we are fighting for, but also to deal with the massive Russian disinformation that is flooding both in Ukraine and many countries. So let me thank you for bringing such a distinguished audience here for this conference and for your generous contribution to support my alma mater. And each and every such kind of the contribution will make not only Ukrainian students, not only Ukrainian teachers, but also the broader Ukrainian society stronger, both resisting the aggressor, but also afterwards, after our victory, on rebuilding Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yulia, for an inspiring talk. I think everybody here who's attending this event stands with Ukraine. And again, it's an honor to have you here. I would also like to thank the audience for attending and participating in this benefit event. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to all my colleagues in Ukraine. We will be putting all the talks up on YouTube after the event is officially over, so you can go back and watch them. And again, we encourage you to give generously. Thank you for all your time. Thank you for all your support. It means a lot to everybody. And Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!